everyone. So fun to see so many people that I've known for such a long time that I haven't seen in forever. John was my TA in a class I took when I was like 3. So lovely to be here. Thank you to Carly, to Danielle, and to my cast for getting me up the hill. This has been a workout. Hopefully will also be a mental workout. Love questions throughout, love to be interrupted. The work that I'll present today is joint work with Karthik Kumar-Jared at UC San Diego and Christopher Walters at UC Berkeley. It is essentially a randomized evaluation of an extra worker intervention in preschool centers in one state of India called Tamil Nadu, which is a southern state. So interrupt me throughout. All right, so let me tell you before I jump into this specific study how this fits into sort of my research agenda. I more broadly care about how to help school systems in low and middle income countries to deal with what I think is their biggest challenge, which is how to educate a growing and increasingly diverse student population. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, depends on which country you're talking about, we've massively expanded access to schooling. And in lower middle income countries, this is access to primary schooling. In upper middle income countries, this is about access to secondary schooling, which is great and was celebrated as it should be. However, it does demand sort of like a shift in expectations for what we demand of our schools. From going to educating, the elites for higher education and potentially government jobs, to making sure that everyone attains the minimum level of competency in both academic and social and emotional skills, right? So how do I focus on this challenge? I focus specifically on 3 ways in which I think we can help school systems deal with this problem, which is first and foremost improving preparation for schooling. So the work that I'll present today very much falls within that bucket. So I will, I have sort of like studied how to improve early childhood education, which is of course entrance into primary schooling, but I also do a lot of work, particularly with upper middle income countries like Argentina, where I'm from, with how to get kids from primary schooling into secondary school. We don't have middle school, but if you are familiar with the US literature on middle school transitions, it is very much sort of like, what do we need to do to get kids who are sort of like accustomed to having a single teacher for a single, for every single subject that they have, to actually having multiple teachers and developing the social and emotional skills that requires to navigate sort of that kind of system. That's bucket 1. Sort of the second group of studies that I do have to do with supporting instruction. So that can happen in 1 or 2 ways. One of them is helping teachers cater to heterogeneous groups by helping them take up sort of different instructional approaches, such as differentiated instruction, or it could be complementing regular chalk and talk instruction with complements such as like ed tech, dynamic, adapted systems that fit to the level of difficulty that the student needs to actually get to the next stage in their learning process. And then thirdly, in my own country of Argentina, I do a lot of work with informing principals of students' achievement, students' internal efficiency information, even student absences. I have a project with Lindsay running in the field right now on this, for them to allocate for them to allocate resources to the students that need them most, right? I do all of this work with randomized evaluations in partnership with governments, nonprofits, and sometimes private companies. I work primarily in South Asia, where I did my postdoc, and in Latin America, where I'm from, obviously. All right, so what am I here to talk about today? Well, so I told you this is a randomized evaluation of an extra worker intervention in preschool centers in India. Why do we care about this? Well, in international development circles, there's at least like growing consensus on the importance of early childhood education. We know that child development is affected by both psychological and biological factors, as well as genetic inheritance. We also have learned the importance of the initial years of a child's life, even though there's a bit of a debate, or I would say misunderstanding of sort of what you can do after that. Hopefully the paper today will be a bit of a hopeful story in that regard. And also we know, especially in developing countries, but not exclusively, early exposure to risk factors can be detrimental to cognitive, motor, and social emotional development. This is great because it has spurred a lot of sort of policy discussions on how to improve early childhood education in these settings. And the consensus is that there's a whole Lancet series on it, that if you provide children with like high quality, high intensity, lasting opportunities to learn, then that can do away with much of sort of the detrimental effects of exposure to risk factors. However, when you look at the actual evidence, it is quite sobering to see that very little of that evidence is evidence on programs that can be scaled up, right? So potentially what I will show you today is an example of a program that is sort of an attempt to improve an existing early childhood education system, which is already at scale. And I will tell you what I mean by scale in just a second, which is a lot. So the program that we're trying to improve is India's early childhood education program, which is the largest early childhood education program in the world. It is called the Integrated Child Development Scheme. I will try not to use acronyms throughout. If I use acronyms throughout and you don't know what I'm talking about, just like call me out on it. I love being called out on using acronyms, but I've looked through this presentation multiple times not to do that to you. It serves about 36 million children between the ages of 3 to 6. It was originally developed in 1975 to cater to low-income areas, and it was expanded to the rest of the country. It provides, and this is super important, both for the US-focused people and for the international education people, it is not just an early childhood education system. It was originally created to provide nutrition to children. Then its functions were expanded to also provide health services, and only more recently have their functions been expanded to considered preschool education. This is very important because you will see that the main worker in these centers actually has a host of different responsibilities. And it does so through this 1.35 million Anganwadi centers. Anganwadi means courtyard shelter. That's the rough translation. Let me show you what they look like. This is typically the layout of an Anganwadi center. So typically it's just one room, could be like this room, something like this, with a worker sitting in the middle, the children sitting around the worker, and almost not pictured here is the second worker that I will introduce in just a second. That is traditionally a helper. The helper does not have the same responsibilities of the worker. It mostly just cooks and cleans in the center. And then obviously, depending on where you are in Tamil Nadu and outside of Tamil Nadu, where you are in India, these centers will look very different. So say, for example, I also did some work in the northern state of Rajasthan, where an Anganwadi center could be basically this big, with none of the learning materials that you're seeing on the walls, with none of the sort of like colorful toys around the children. So the conditions of these centers actually vary quite a bit. This is a picture of the center, if I'm not mistaken, taken in Chennai, which is the capital city. We're going to be focusing for this study in rural Anganwadi centers, which look much less well-researched than the one over here. Now, I'll give you some statistics just to characterize sort of the context. All right, I told you about these Anganwadi centers. They have two main staffers. Let's call them that as a general term so that we can distinguish between them. One of them is the actual Anganwadi worker. The Anganwadi worker has a host of different responsibilities. I mean, 21 different responsibilities spanning health, nutrition, and education. Okay, so let me just not for you to read them one by one, but for you to get a sense of the magnitude of the challenge for an Anganwadi worker of what she has to do. So that means she has to, say, for example, do things like home visitations to help mothers interact better with their children, to provide psychosocial stimulation, as well as coordinate vaccinations for the mothers and the children, as well as teach preschool education. And oh, by the way, in addition to all these tasks, given that Anganwadi workers are sort of like people of trust in the community, they're often pulled to do, say, things like help with elections or help promote a program that the government has. So just like I say, whenever I present a study on instruction in India where kids spend 7 different grade levels within a classroom, and I say, no human, no matter how good a teacher you are, could possibly cater to 7 different grade levels. Well, no human being, no matter how hardworking you are, can possibly do 21 tasks at the level of quality that they are expected to do. Okay, yes?
About how many children typically attend this center?
I will tell you in just a second. Thank you. So then we have a second staffer. The second staffer is called the helper, and the helper doesn't have an equal level of responsibility as the worker. They are mostly responsible for collecting the children to come to the center, for doing some cooking and doing some cleaning. However, in spite of this massive early childhood education program, learning levels are very, very low. About 43% of first graders can't recognize letters, and 36 cannot recognize 1-digit numbers. And as probably you've inferred from sort of the emphasis that I put on the 21 tasks that the workers have to do, the many tasks of the workers kind of get in the way with the responsibility of providing preschool education. So before we did the study, and to the extent that you're interested in the policy engagement side and not the research side, you should ask me questions about it because there's a lot to say, but I won't emphasize it today. One of the things that we did before we introduced this intervention to the government is actually go to the everybody centers. I went to 24 different centers in rural, tribal, and urban areas in Tamil Nadu, and we just sat there for the 2 hours that were expected, that the workers were expected to provide preschool education. We just tracked how much of that time was actually being devoted to providing preschool education. On average, in spite of the fact that workers were expected to provide about 120 minutes of preschool education, they were providing roughly 38 minutes of preschool education. So there's a big margin for improvement in terms of time allocation.
So does that mean children are there for 2 hours or children are there?
Children are there for much longer, and I will show you a schedule in just a second. Yeah. All right, so the intervention is we partnered with the government of Tamil Nadu, which is the state in which we're working, to introduce an extra worker, which for differentiation, we're gonna call facilitator. So remember, we have a worker, that's the main worker, we have the helper, the cooking and cleaning, and then we have a facilitator, which is the part of the intervention, who will be exclusively devoted to teaching, okay? They were hired at a 2-year contract. They were eligible based on the criteria that were very similar to the workers. That means that they had to be female, they had to be about 18 years old, they had to reside in the local community. This is mostly a provision to ensure that the workers and facilitators actually attend the centers regularly. And then the only difference between the facilitator and the worker requirements is that while workers are expected to pass grade 12, facilitators are expected to pass grade 10. Okay, so just like a minor difference in terms of educational attainment. And then because they were expected to work about half the time per day as the worker, they were paid roughly half the salary. So a worker in Tamil Nadu is paid on average about 8,000 rupees. $1 is about 68 rupees. Facilitator is paid about 4,000 rupees. Okay. So they received 6 days of training. You might think that's not enough. I will come back to this in a couple of bullets. And the training was exclusively devoted to how to provide early childhood education. And this is only for the intervention and for impact evaluation. We asked them to complete a daily register of activities just to say what they actually do. To our surprise, a lot of them actually did it and they had it up to date. And I will show you the numbers on that in just a second. Now, I want to pause for a second and just clarify that the context was super favorable for this intervention and for sort of external validity discussions that might be important down the line. So first and foremost, Tamil Nadu is one of the most economically developed states of India. So India has its own index of human development, and Tamil Nadu consistently ranks in the top third of that. It also had already experimented with a 2-worker model. So going back to our discussions on policy engagement, we did our homework, and not only did we document the problem, but we also sort of sifted through the government records and said, oh, the World Bank in the 80s had this experiment, with not experiment in terms of research, but experiment in terms of trying something out with the government, in which it introduced an additional staffer in Anwadi centers. Everyone was very optimistic about this sort of like pilot program that they had, but as soon as the World Bank money dried up, that program had to end. So a big part of our study is going to be convincing the government that this is a worthy intervention in which to invest its money. And I'm going to present to you 3 different ways to think about the cost effectiveness of this intervention. And perhaps most importantly, especially if you're like fixing on this, I see you, John Pepe, then the government had, together with UNICEF, specified very clearly what it expected Anwadi workers and now facilitators to do at every moment of the school day. So let me give you an example, Lindsay, also to your question about when these centers are open and what they were expected to do with their time. Centers are open at 9, and between 9:45 and 10 happens a welcome prayer. Then there's, according to the curriculum, a monthly theme. In this case, the monthly theme was what is in my village. Then there's a section devoted to knowledge gain. There's a snack break. There's a lot of eating and sleeping in Anwadi centers, which is the most adorable part of doing the study. Then there's some language development, physical development, mind and social development. Then there's more food preparation and hand washing, lunch break, and then nap time, which is the most adorable thing ever. And then there's, for the older children, school readiness. We're not going to focus on this part. We're going to consider the 120 minutes that are devoted to preschool education for all the children who attend the center. The last part is for the older children, and typically that does not happen at all.
Like, just about the families of these kids, like what are the parents doing while their kids are in preschool?
Yeah, so typically, the mothers are the primary caregivers in these settings. They come, they drop off the kids. If not the mothers, they actually, sometimes the aunts or grandmothers could come. Sometimes they actually stay in the centers, and we might come back to that once we get to our discussion of the nutrition impacts of our intervention. And then they go ahead and do some rural work. So all of these 4 districts where we did the study, and I will describe them in greater detail in just a second, are rural districts. So they're helping with, say, for example, they could work in community health centers, they could work they could be homemakers, they could just have a number of occupations that require that they actually have reliable childcare. I don't know if that sort of rings a bell in, personally or in the US policy debates, but that's basically what they typically do. And then their parents would also have some sort of formal occupation or informal occupation in the rural sector as well. Yeah, does that help? Yeah.
And similar to external validity question, should we think of this as the public option that most people who have one nearby will access it, but the elite might not access it? Have a private
Absolutely.
center?
And I will show you some numbers about that in just a second. Go ahead.
So feel free to defer this question if we're gonna get to it later, but you sort of framed this as thinking about how to, like, what interventions work at scale.
Mhm.
And I guess I'm just wondering what you have in mind when you say that an intervention scales. Is it that, like, the government can just take this intervention and roll it out entirely on their own without
Mhm.
research or intervention and expect to find the same effects?
Mhm.
And if that's the case, how much were you all involved in the
Mhm.
actual, like, development and implementation versus just sort of saying, hey, government, will you take this thing that has been studied previously and run with it? Oh.
The intervention was entirely
Got it.
from beginning to end handled by them. And that is super important to us because I know that in research discussions, Poverty Action Lab is best known by some of its earliest RCTs in which the researchers were heavily involved in not only conducting the research, but actually designing the intervention and to some extent actually handholding the implementation of the intervention. This is not going to be the case. So they developed a process to hire the facilitators. They stipulated the eligibility requirements. They did all the hiring, they did all the training, they did all the paying. And so all we did is actually track to what extent those things were happening, but we did not sort of influence that process at all. That's very important point. Excellent. All right. So what is our sample for our study? Our sample includes 320 Wadi centers across 4 rural districts. This will be part of a broader study. Now we'll come back to that once we discuss the cost effectiveness of this intervention. We selected these 4 districts to be representative of a population of roughly 60 million people. So we randomly sampled these 4 districts from across the state, excluding Chennai, which is the capital state. We mostly excluded it not only because Chennai looks very different from the rest of Tamil Nadu, but also because in Chennai there's a lot of cross-center collaboration. So John might be, well, actually, Angwadi workers are all female. So Lindsay would be, so let's say, coordinating this center, but she might also hop over to the second center, or sometimes the second center and this center would share or cross-collaborate. And we just wanted to have sort of a clean test of what introducing an additional worker would mean. And obviously, a third reason is that the rural districts are the districts in most need of support, right? We stratify our selection by geographic zones and our average nutritional status. And if you're unfamiliar with India or Tamil Nadu, Tamil Nadu is in the south of India, and the 4 rural districts are across the state, as you can see over here. Okay. Yeah.
Those 4 districts are chosen ad hoc, right? And then
Chosen?
ad hoc, like you chose those.
We
and
randomly sample those. Yeah.
But within the districts, the 4 districts are chosen.
No. We randomly sample the districts, and then within the sample districts, we randomly sample the sectors. Is that? Yeah. Excellent. All right. So we sample them, especially as I specify here. Something that's important that we did for external validity purposes, we compare the sampled and non-sampled districts on the characteristics that we used for sampling purposes. They seem exactly to be the same. Let me show you that super quickly. So on the variables of education and nutrition, most specifically that you would care about, they look quite similar, which gives us an indication that these 4 districts would be representative of rural Tamil Nadu in expectation, excuse me. We randomly sampled within those 4 districts, the 320 centers. We excluded centers that had other interventions. Obviously, we didn't want to pick up interactions. We wanted to pick up the effect of our intervention alone. We excluded centers in which buildings were shared with other centers or in which there were vacancies for the workers. We didn't want the facilitator to become the main worker. We wanted the facilitator to complement the work that the worker was already doing. We stratified our selection by worker vacancy and administrative unit. Turned out that worker vacancy, as reported by the government, was not a super reliable indicator of whether there was an actual vacancy. Go figure. We worked with the government to make sure that all of the vacancies were filled prior to the start of the study. So everything is an extra staffer, which is called a facilitator and not a main worker. Yes.
So it's that you excluded some other interventions going on. Is that typical? Like that centers might be receiving interventions or testing things out?
At a relatively small scale. So say, for example, Pratham, which is the largest education nonprofit in the world, has a lot of interventions that they're constantly trying out with state governments at a small scale. And so we just left those out. They weren't a large share of our sampling frame, excuse me. All right, and then we randomly assigned half of the centers to receive the facilitators. Just to address some of the questions that you were all asking me about what these centers look like. Focus for a second in column 1 here. The number of children that were registered at the centers were on average 20, but about 15 were actually there when we showed up for baseline. Roughly less than a third were located next to a primary school. About 4% functioned jointly with another center, even though they didn't share the building. As I told you before, most of them had an electricity connection, kitchen, and a toilet. In terms of the workers, the main worker was on average 15 years of age. About 83% of them had passed grade 10. They had 23 years of experience. It's a job that you take on for life for most of the cases. They also importantly received every year 6 days of training. So this is not sort of uneven with what the facilitator was receiving. A few of them also received preschool training, and then in salary, as I said, was about 8,000. There could be some reasons for variability. Now you're all focusing on the stars over here. Yes, we've been unlucky that this sometimes happen in randomized evaluations. So we're going to include in all of our specifications that I'll present today, the 2 variables in which we have an imbalance. Age and experience are obviously, as you might imagine, correlated, and see if that makes a difference. It turns out that it doesn't. In terms of the children, in response to some of the questions that were posed, obviously half of them were female. The average age was about 3.5. Don't focus on the weight for age and height for age score. Instead, focus on the share of children who were underweight or stunted. These are, as it pertains to the World Health Organization sort of standards for what it would be, what height and weight you should be per age. And about a third of them or more were underweight and or stunted. And obviously we didn't find any imbalance in the tests of math, reading, and executive function. Yes.
So another one from the chat, are attendance rates of the workers high, are they balanced or high, the pre?
Sorry?
The attendance rates of the workers.
I will show you that in just a second.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right. So, yes,
Just
go ahead.
one other quick contextual question,
always.
just from the
Sorry, I'm
government's
like getting hot. Do you mind if I just pull this down?
We can do
please,
it,
please.
we'll do it.
Oh, thank you so much.
From the government's perspective, when they're doing this,
Ah.
are they thinking that we are permanently providing this program on into the future? Or are they thinking, we know this research team's gonna evaluate it and this is like a trial?
Very good question. So you're giving me all the scale of questions, which I love because they give me the opportunity to feature the sort of the policy engagement part, which I don't think is as clear. For the government, it was very clear this was a trial, so they wanted to understand whether this would work because they knew that they had done it before, but they hadn't evaluated it properly. To the workers and the facilitators, which I think is where you're going, it was also very clear that this was a 2-year experiment, and there was no expectation whatsoever for the facilitators that this would be turning into a worker job down the line. You might be familiar with the work on contract teachers in Kenya and India, in which, at least in Kenya, the contract teachers the contract teachers in grade 1 worked very well. Once the government tried to take that up, the contract teachers organized to become regular teachers, and therefore the government actually changed the provisions for what a contract teacher would be, and therefore once evaluated at scale didn't have the same impact as the original experiment. So that if that's where you're going, it was very clearly signaled from the government that that's not where they were going. Also, Anguanti workers are not civil service workers, and so you don't have as clear of an incentive to try to become one. Although certainly, given this experience, you could potentially apply just like everyone else. You would just have sort of like the experience of having been a facilitator. Does that help?
That helps.
Cool, awesome. In terms of the data, we collected 5 different types of data. We obviously assessed children in math, language, and executive function. We assessed them one-on-one, orally, and in the local language. That was Tamil. If you're interested in what exactly we tested, this was so much fun. So we tested kids at baseline and a subset of the items that we administered at Inline. In Inline, as I will explain to you in a couple of minutes, we tested kids not only in the centers, but also in the households for some of the reasons that Pierre was raising before. And we tested them on numeracy, literacy, and a host of executive function skills. So memory, self-control, and also focus, okay? We also measured children's height and weight, baseline and end line. The entire intervention is about 18 months. So everything that I present between baseline and end line, you should think about 18 months spanning between those 2 points. And we also measured children at households and at centers for reasons that I'm going to elaborate on in just a second. We tracked implementation fidelity with 2 surveys. So this is not a situation in which we're coming constantly to the center in a way that you're changing your behavior because you know the JPEL people are coming to your center. We also tracked, as the question was posted in the chat, not only whether the centers were open, but whether the workers and the facilitators were attending consistently. And we tracked, as you might imagine, given the experiment, the share of official preschool education time that was actually devoted to instruction. We did this in a random selected half of the centers. And so our results are slightly less power than for the child level outcomes. Questions on data? Lovely. All right, so in terms of attrition, the main challenge that we face in evaluating any intervention in an Augmenting center is that parents have their preconceptions about how an Augmenting center is going to serve their kid in terms of education vis-a-vis outside options, okay? And so what happens is something like this. This is not data from our study, but it is data from the same state and districts, okay? I'm plotting here in the x-axis the age of the children, and then the y-axis the share of the children that are involved in different options. So the first thing that I want you to focus on is on the light gray, which is Anguanti centers. You can see that at age 2, about 60% of children are enrolled in Anguanti centers. As they become old, and especially as they reach age 5, which is the age of preschool education, the parents pull them out of Anguanti centers. And you're thinking, okay, where are they going? Well, some of them are going to private preschools. Obviously, if you have the means, you can obviously do that. But the other thing is you could enroll them in grade 1 or above, even when they're age 5 and they're not exactly of age to be in grade 1, right? So there's this perception that Anguanti centers are not for education. And the moment that the kids are of age or close to being of age, the parents pull them out. Obviously, going back to our conversation about the difficulties of running randomized evaluations, if you're planning an N-line, that is a bit of a problem, right? Because you typically would love those people who were there at baseline to also be there at N-line. So what we did is we collected learning and nutrition data, not just in the centers, but also in a random subset of the households. Specifically, we targeted about 50% of the children that were present at the baseline, oversampling those underweight children so that our nutrition estimates will be well powered. We reweight all of our results that are based on the household sample to be representative of a full baseline sample. And as we expected, our follow-up rates were very different across these 2 measurements. So whereas in the centers, the follow-up rate was only 33%, in the households, our follow-up rate was 89%. Importantly, though, there was no differential attrition in either one of those samples, and I'm going to come back to that later on. Now, then, knowing this, how should you interpret the 2 sets of estimates that I will provide to you, which are the center-based estimates and the household-based estimates? Well, you should focus on the center-based estimate as sort of like the effect of the program for the children who attended consistently throughout those 18 months, okay? And you should think of the household estimates as sort of the ITT type of estimates for offering the policy regardless of the children, of whether the children attended. Many of these children have sort of aged out, as I showed you in that graph. They didn't actually age out because you could attend an Agawadi Center from age 3 to 6, but as parents believe that they aged out, they pull them out, okay? And if you actually compare the age of the children and the baseline, center sample, and the household sample, you can see that the household sample is much older. You're much more likely to be age 5 and above if you're in that inline sample as compared to the center sample, okay? So everything that I will show you, especially for the child level outcomes for both the center assessments or the center measurements and the household assessments or the center measurements, and that's how you should think about those two types of effects. Just to drive the point home that some of the differences that you will see between the center level results and the household level results are driven by exposure, we also estimate effects on what we're calling the common sample, which is the subset of kids that we observed both in the centers and in the households, okay? Great. This is an RCT. The empirical strategy is relatively straightforward. We regress an outcome for the child I enrolled in Agawadi Center C on randomization straight affects effects, a vector of baseline covariates that includes a measure of the outcome variable at baseline, as well as those teacher level covariates on which we found imbalance at baseline, an indicator variable for treatment assignment, and that is pretty much it. All of our estimates are clustering results at the center level. Okay, let's start with the results, which are super exciting. I know there's a lot of context, but I have to do this for a US audience. All right, first and foremost, the intervention happened as intended. Virtually all the centers actually hired the facilitators in the first round, which happened of intervention monitoring, which happened roughly 5 months after the baseline. 98% of the centers had a facilitator. That's why it's super important for you to understand that Tamil Nadu is not like every other state in India, okay? Then, in fact, the facilitator was hired within 15 to 30 days of the government order going out. Importantly, for the result that I will show you, the government order made it very clear that if we hired Carly to be the facilitator, then Danielle, who was the main worker, should be doing things other than preschool education. This will become super important. The reason why we were hiring Carly is so that Danielle could do other things, not that this should reflect any personal experience. Okay, great. Nearly all the facilitators have received those 6 days of training. The majority of the centers actually had this activity register that we asked facilitators to complete. In fact, 71% had it updated to the date that we showed up by surprise on the center. And the government circulated this order just specifying this division of labor, as I said before, okay?
So can I
Yes,
ask one other-
please,
You might have said
please.
this, and I just.
No, don't worry, I'm speaking
What
very
were the
fast.
requirements for the facilitators in terms of like professional background?
So nothing other than what I showed you on the graph. So you had to be female, you had to be about 18 years of age, you had to reside in the local community, and the facilitators had to pass grade 10. The workers had to pass grade 12. That's the only difference in the requirements between the facilitators and the
But
workers.
these are not educational professionals.
No.
That they're just getting 6 days of training on like how to be a teacher.
Which is
and we're just
super
applying it
important.
in the classroom.
Yeah, which is why it's super important for you to understand that the government had this super prescriptive curriculum telling them exactly what they needed to do with every minute of their time of preschool education. Because if you didn't have that, then obviously putting an untrained non-high school graduate in a classroom with 6 days of training can be total disaster, right? Yes. So also something that I'll come back to in the contributions is how to think about these types of interventions, say, as differently from in a middle upper income country, say like Colombia. Colombia had an experiment with non-formally trained teachers that went disastrously from something like, say, Tamil Nadu in India, right? Where, you know, the learning levels are so low that if you just give some basic level of prescription of what to do, you can actually sort of improve quite a bit. Very, very different context, very different policy discussions. All right, finding number 1. When we introduced the facilitator, the centers were much more likely to be open. Okay, so here I'm showing you the share of centers that were open by 9 a.m., which is the time in which they had to be open, 10 a.m., which is the prescribed preschool education start time. And if you weren't open by 10 a.m., we considered you close. Okay, so these two are cumulative, 40. If you were open by 9 a.m., you were open by 10 a.m. And if you were not open by 10 a.m., you were close. So far, so good? Cool. Column number 1 is the control center. So about 40% of control centers were open by 9 a.m. About 90% were open by 10 a.m. We improved that by about 9 percentage points, which in terms of percentage increase is an improvement of 70% in the share of centers that were open. You might think, why would the centers be open? All right. I told you that the worker has 21 different tasks. So she has to show up now to open the center because she owns the key to the center. And now that I'm going to use this throughout. Is that okay? Okay, cool. So if Carly was our main worker and Danielle was showing up as the facilitator, now Carly had to show up, more often to open the center for Danielle. Now you might not think, okay, well, cool, that's one hypothesis, but how would you know that's true? We don't actually know it's true, but if you compare the attendance rates, which I will show you in the next slides, between the facilitators and the workers, you will see that in treatment centers, they're roughly comparable, which sort of supports the interpretation that it is the worker that has to now show up to open the center for the facilitator. Okay, let's get to attendance. The structure of this table is exactly the same. Here we find that worker absence decreased by about 10 percentage points, which is about 50% from the baseline. So now I'm showing you not the share of centers, but the share of workers who arrived by 9 a.m., 10 a.m. And if you were not arrived by 10 a.m., we marked you as absent. We have another measure of absent, which I will show you in a couple of slides. So in the control centers, about 12.5% of the workers showed up by 9 a.m., 80% had shown up by 10 a.m., and about 20% were absent. That is, they hadn't shown up by 10 a.m. Now we improved that given the intervention by 10 percentage points, which means about a 50% improvement. Now, what I told you before was look at this 10% for the treatment workers attendance and 8.7% for the facilitators. To compare those two numbers, they seem quite similar, which gives you the indication that maybe Carly was showing up to open the door for Danielle. Go ahead.
So I have this question, and I asked visits by who?
By our enumerators in our team.
So they were done like, I'm just wondering why you have effects at 10 a.m. but not say at 9 a.m. Maybe if your
Great question.
were there at 9 and the word goes around, hey, there are people saying, go open the school, I don't know. Could that be the?
Okay, so first and foremost, let me answer the first part, which is why would you see effects at 10 a.m. and not by 9 a.m.? That reinforces my previous interpretation. If the reason why Carly's showing up is opening the door for Danielle, then she's not going to show up earlier than Danielle is supposed to show up. She's going to show up when Danielle is expected to start preschool education, which is precisely at 10 a.m. Thank you for.
But then
reminding
why
me.
check at 9 a.m. at all?
Sorry?
Why check whether it's open at 9 at all? If there's,
Say that
if
again?
you don't expect them like, to be interested in opening at 9 a.m., why check at 9 a.m.?
It's not, so the worker, as per her requirements, she should be opening the center so that the center is open by 9 a.m. So that's why we wanted to check, right? And then also, we didn't sort of fully anticipate the story. We saw the story unfold as we were sort of sifting through the data, right? Which is did I touch it?
It's probably because you're.
Oh, I keep like, sorry guys. Oh. Thank you, sorry. Thank you. All right, so that's the first part. And then you were saying, could people tell each other?
It's rural.
So yeah, so we did like attendance checks like randomly. Now that doesn't preclude the possibility that people are texting each other. Workers definitely have WhatsApp groups. But if that's the case, then this is an underestimate of the true effect of the introduction of the facilitator on worker attendance, not the opposite, right? Like you can sign the potential bias in that attendance estimate improvement. Cool. Questions? All right.
Why are the arrival rates so low?
Yeah.
Like at the
What do
9
you
a.m.
mean?
rates, they're so low, like, don't the kids show up and then there's nobody there for them?
They could wait. Yeah. Sometimes they wait. Yeah. We I should tell you my WhatsApp. But like, like I had like sometimes my RAs would accompany the enumerators. They're like, it's 11 a.m. We've been like eating every snack possible and like the worker has not shown up. In fact, for the tracking of the time, we had to announce them, right? Because otherwise, like it would have been possible that the enumerators were showing up and there was nothing to observe, right? So all the time on task stuff is going to be conditional on you knowing that we're showing up. Yeah. Now, okay, like everything does depend on sort of what your parameters are, right? Like in the work that Karthik is very known for, in addition to all this other work. Whatever, I shouldn't have said that. Carly is known for many different type of studies, but one study that is very well known is teacher attendance study that he conducted in secondary schools. And 1 in 4 teachers there was just absent, right? So like, if that is your benchmark, then this looks actually quite good. I don't know. So it really does depend on sort of what you're thinking of and what the different incentives are. But yeah, I think like you had some incentive there, but you really had the incentive here, which is why we think that that is consistent with our interpretation of why Carly was showing up in time. Okay, sorry. All right. What about use of time? So now I'm telling you, Carly, I'm showing up to observe your center. I'm not telling you exactly that I'm tracking your time to task, but I'm sitting in your center, so you know that I'm coming. Now, conditional on those on Carly showing up, how does she allocate those 120 minutes of preschool education time? Well, we found that workers reallocated time exactly as expected. So now that Danielle is here to take care of preschool education, Carly's going to do less preschool education and more of other things. Let me guide you through it. This is minutes per day spent on preschool education, admin tasks, health and nutrition, off duty, or absent. Now, this is a very different measure of absence than the one that I showed you before. Now, during 120 minutes, I'm going to be every 6 minutes tracking whether you're showing up. So Carly could be absent, absent, present, present, absent, present, absent, absent, right? Like that is a much more granular measure of whether Carly was present or not. Okay, ignore for a second column 1, which is the facilitators, and focus for a second on the control workers. So on average, control workers were spending 38 minutes on preschool education. Do you remember that number? That was exactly the number that we found in that descriptive study that we did in 24 centers. Sometimes sampling variation is like something, it's magic. 22 minutes on admin tasks, about 6 minutes on health and nutrition, 30 minutes being off duty, and about 24 minutes being absent. Now, if you compare that with the treatment workers, they were spending a lot less time, about 20 fewer minutes on preschool education, is exactly as expected because now Danielle was showing up to do that. More time on admin tasks, more time on health and nutrition, more time on off duty, and you might say, oh, careful there, more time on off duty. Okay, but if you compare the time that was spent on off duty and absent, they actually roughly cancel each other out, right? So it's not that you should think of the effect of workers as they reallocated the time that those 120 minutes rather than they just turned out to spend less time on average during those 120 minutes that they were supposed to teach preschool education. Okay, that's for the workers. What about for the facilitators? Well, the facilitators were providing on average about the facilitators were providing on average roughly an hour of preschool education per day. They were still helping out, even though they were not supposed to, with admin tasks, some health and nutrition tasks. They were also sometimes off duty and sometimes absent. So if you add the time that the facilitators and the treatment workers spent on the different tasks, this accounts to about a doubling of the time on preschool education and about a near tripling of the time in health and nutrition. Okay, so this is a considerable shift in time devoted to health and education. We can, in the Q&A, if I leave you any time, discuss about how they distributed time within each of these categories. We have the data on all of that.
Sorry,
Yes,
I think you said at the beginning, this is conditional on everyone showing up.
This is all, yes, conditional distribute site analysis. Yeah.
So if you visited to record these numbers and no one was there, those are excluded.
No, we didn't. No. The center openings and attendance were unannounced visits. Okay, so we didn't tell you. The other ones were announced. All of them were announced. We didn't drop any. Yeah.
I was trying to figure out if this is like a lower bound and actually.
No, and this is super confusing. Yeah.
And then when we're thinking about the time spent on preschool education, is like facilitators and workers, was it captured if they like were overlapping spending time?
I love that. Educational people, we're so hopeful. We're so hopeful. No. So not at all. So if you track the time that they were doing these things at the same time, there is 0 minutes in which they're teaching the same time. So if you're also thinking you're a US person, you're like class size reduction anyone? No, that's not what's going on, even though we're going to claim that we have some suggestive evidence for the class size reduction people, but it's not exactly as clean as we want it to be. Yeah.
Sorry, really quick. So can you just explain again the difference between like off duty and absent?
Hmm.
Is it, yeah.
of duties, you're at the center. You're just not doing any of the other three types of main tasks that you're supposed to be doing. And the absent is you're just not there. You're not.
So you're like physically not.
Yeah, let me show you. So you could be uninvolved, you could be out of a center for reasons that are unknown. You could be out of a center doing admin duties, or it could be like, oh, she went to talk to the supervisor, for example. You could be doing home visitations, that's technically part of your job. You could be doing health duties, so say, for example, she could be coordinated with someone to do vaccinations, or she could be just like having a social interaction. All these categories are so dirty, right? Because like once the worker was out of the center, we had to ask the helper what the worker was doing. And so to some extent, you're relying on that. But we're also, okay, economists, if education people are too hopeful, economists are too cynical, right? So like the other thing that I would point out is these things that are like, like social interaction, it could be that like some mother showed up and you're seeming like you're having a social interaction, but maybe you're giving that mother some advice on, how to interact with her child or whatever. You're talking about the diet of the child. So something like that. So it's not super clear, which is going to be why this near tripling of time in health and nutrition that in absolute terms doesn't seem to be that big of an improvement could potentially have, could be only part of the story. Could be other things going on that we're just not able to capture given our measurement strategy. Good point. All right, so what about learning? Well, in terms of learning, we found impacts. Let's focus for a second on panel A, which is the central level assessments. We found impacts. These are all standardized scores with respect to the control group of about 0.29 standard deviations in math, 0.46 in language, 0.18 in executive function. And because I work with economists, we did a composite score. That composite score is going to be very useful for us to do cost effectiveness calculation because we're going to just average throughout. But if you're interested in interpretation, maybe these three are the main. So obviously the impacts that we see on the household assessments are lower. And in the case of executive function, not statistically significant because, as I said before, the impacts on the household level assessments are for those children who might have aged out of the program during. Now, if you question that interpretation, one way to think about it is to compare the learning improvements for the center assessments, for the household assessments, for the children that you observed in both places. And you will see that not only are the household assessments in that case larger, but they're like actually closer to the center level assessments. Yes, go ahead.
Should we think of these two as like balance? One being like that, you were saying how the household is more of an ITT and then the center.
Like some TOT. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Do we know the extent when the curriculum, the scripted curriculum is meant to focus more on one of these math or language?
So no, in that, like I showed you sort of a simple schedule, but there is time for sort of like numeracy, literacy, and this social emotional development. Now, it is certainly to some extent prescriptive, but the extent to which they like operationalize that in the field, we didn't like capture, we don't have videos of the lesson. So I wouldn't be able to say, like this component was well implemented and this other component will be not well implemented. But at face, like it's sort of a first blush, it wouldn't seem to like emphasize, for example, literacy more than numeracy or so to speak. John?
Yeah, I think you'll get there, but you're gonna talk about attrition? Yeah. Okay.
No more. No, go ahead.
So can you tell about, right, you had huge attrition, especially for A, but also for B.
So 33% follow-up for the center assessments, 89% follow-up for the household assessments. Tell me what were you interested in?
Well, so can you talk about, like, you said there wasn't differential attrition. Is that just in number of, like, share of students you get data for, or do you have differential in terms of, like, baseline measures?
Both. So let me show you first. So we don't find sort of differential attrition in terms of your probability of showing up for the center level assessments or the household level assessments. We also tested, I'm sorry, it's super tiny. If treatment female age, weight for age C-score, height for age C-score, the composite score measured at baseline, and then we have the interactions between treatment, all these variables. And if you say, for example, tests, if you look at the sort of the p-value of the F test for all those interactions, you would find that the p-value is about 0.6298 in the center level assessments and 0.857 in the household level assessment. So both in the terms of your propensity to show up and also in terms of your observable characteristics, we don't see in terms of differential attrition. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool.
One other thing that I'm thinking about is the household assessment. If those are the kids who are more likely to have aged out, they're just gonna be older. Are they older? Are they, like, are older children more likely to be just in the household assessment? And their baseline may be, the control group value may be higher because they're in first grade, and that may leave just less room for improvement in that group.
So the household level sample was older, as I remember I showed you those
Yeah.
distributions, sorry. So the household level is definitely older. In terms of room for improvement, there was a huge lot, right? Like, so most of the kids, sorry, I should just show you this, which is very helpful. These are the proportion correct scores, right? So for the control group in the household level, about 30, like the average student in the household level assessments got 33% of the questions correctly, 31% of the questions in math correctly, about 41% of the executive function questions correctly. We did this separately by age. We don't find meaningful differences. We also did heterogeneous effects, interacting treatment with age. Still don't find any significance there. Yeah, so the age story doesn't seem to be like sort of explaining why you're seeing these different effects, but yeah, it's a good point. Cool. All right. So that's what we expected, right? We hired someone to teach more, they taught more, the other person did more other stuff, and then the kids learn more. Great, right? We should go home. But like, two remarkable things, I think that give it for a second. Two remarkable things is, first of all, you would think, okay, well, you know, like the most of the games is some kids just didn't know any numbers, didn't know any letters. You just taught them some numbers and letters, and because of those very initially low performing kids, you're just like getting these huge treatment estimates. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case, and you can think about it in two ways. You can plot treatment effects based on your baseline composite score, or you could plot baseline treatment effects in terms of your N-line composite score, giving you quantile treatment effects. However you cut it, it actually, what seems to be the story is that regardless of where you were in the baseline or the N-line distribution, you're benefiting roughly the same, right? So you're seeing the distance between the treatment and the control groups are roughly the same across the distributions. Okay, sorry, this is what I was going to say. If that had been the whole story, we would have been really happy with that paper, but we actually found impacts on nutrition, which we find to be quite remarkable. So here I'm showing you for the center level measurements, impacts on the weight for age scores, the share of children who are underweight or severely underweight, and then I'm showing you the impacts on the height for age scores, the proportion of kids who are stunted or who are severely stunted. We found an impact of 0.96 standard deviations for the weight for age scores. We found a reduction of about 3 percentage points for the kids who were severely underweight. We found an improvement of 9.2 standard deviation, 0.92 standard deviations on height for age scores, and a reduction in the proportion of kids who were stunted and severely stunted of 4.8 percentage points and 2.3 percentage points respectively, which is great, right? That means that sort of that relative improvement in health and nutrition combined with things, as we were discussing before, that we potentially did not capture well, such as like informal interactions between the workers who now have more time and the mothers, led to these improvements in height and weight for age. Yes, go ahead.
From the chat, it was any data collected on siblings and would be interested to know about positive or negative.
We didn't find any spillover effects. I'm not going to present them here. Yeah, good question. All right. Again, we do quantile treatment effects and we plot effects based on baseline scores. And again, the story seems to be the same. So we, just like the learning gains, the nutrition gains were broad-based and across the baseline and the N-line distributions, not only for WAS, but also for Haas. Oh, I used two acronyms that you didn't tell me that. Weight for age and height for age, Jesse, go ahead.
Sorry, the results are coming in a bit fast. I'm trying to understand. So what
All
is
of it, yeah,
the
sorry.
channel that's leading to these gains? Is it, so this, like the facilitator comes in and that frees up time for the worker to then communicate more clearly with parents? Or is it that they're providing more nutritious meals in the center? Or do you have a sense of like, I just wouldn't have never expected this to happen as a result of intervention.
So partly it is the increase, partly is the increase in time that the worker could devote to health and nutrition tasks, right? So at in these announced visits, we found that about, on average, the control workers were spending about 6 minutes on health and nutrition, and this was nearly tripled with the introduction of the facilitator.
And that's just like talking to the kids about healthy eating?
No, so that could be a host of things, so that's where I was going next.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Different.
So, no. So I was going to just show you this. So we tracked for each category what we meant by the different subcategories. So they spent more time preparing or serving foods, and then we didn't find any effect on assisting children to use the toilet, and then we found sort of an impact on other health-related activities, which could mean a host of different things. Now, this is exactly what we were talking about in our walk, right? Like, does this tell you the whole story of like what exactly they were doing? No. We just know that they were devoting more time to that, and preparing a certain food could like mean a host of different things. What I would tell you is like every Anguari center does receive a specific food allotment based on the number of children that they have. So it's not all of a sudden like you can like just like double that. And whenever you have kids who are under nutritional thresholds, you also receive some supplemental nutrition as part of the ICS program. So again, like you couldn't gain those things. You couldn't actually just like over-report the number of children that you had in your center to receive more of that.
But it is possible that the worker could have just like been better about like forcing kids to actually eat.
Yeah, now she had more time to do it. I mean, not forcing, maybe.
I think I feel Cheerios.
We're not encouraging any of that, but yes, absolutely. Now you could, right? And as I showed Carly, like, it's not like the worker was like, oh, let me just supervise this preschool. She was like really doing other things. Right?
It's also just kind of remarkable because all these, I mean, I guess it just accumulates over the course of the year, but the actual change in the volume of time across all these tasks in a given day is like quite small. We're talking like 4 minutes on preparing food, 30 minutes of educational instruction. You're showing us like these quite large effects on critical outcomes. And so just understanding like what's going on in that time seems really important.
Yeah. Well, so 6 minutes per day is the improvement overall in health and nutrition. And then you have that like for, like 18 months. Right?
Yeah, so you gotta integrate
on a
it.
per day basis, it's like very tiny, but they're also, I think the more remarkable part is actually, or equally remarkable part is how old these kids are, right? Like we're not talking about like 0 to 2 year olds where we know that we can do like sort of these kinds of improvements in nutrition. We're talking about children who are relatively old, and therefore it is remarkable that you observe that. Okay. I know. Don't kill me. You didn't notice though that I was like racing through it. I'm going to show you 3 ways to think about cost effectiveness. I'm going to show you them quick, but I'm happy to talk to all of you afterwards. The first thing that we did, we calculated the benefit cost ratio or the rate of return of a program. So just how the estimated benefits of a program compared to its costs. We calculated the benefits as the PDV of projected improvements in participants' future earnings, estimating them from those short-term treatment effects. And we used the impact on the household assessment specifically, which importantly are our best estimate of the impact on the full population, but also importantly, ignore any nutrition effects. Because as you might remember, there were no statistically significant impacts on nutrition, and therefore we don't capture those in the cost benefit estimation for the household sample. We also did it in the paper for the center level assessments, which ignored these benefits to the kids who attended for part of those 18 months, but at the same time, they incorporate all the nutrition case, and I'm happy to talk to you all about that. All right, both of these calculations, though, ignore any non-labor market benefits of having a better education or better health, okay? So costs are just program costs, which are 2 main things. First of all, the salary of the facilitator, and secondly, the training of the facilitator. And then from a public finance perspective, this is a number that you care about, of course, because it informs how you allocate that sort of marginal dollar, right? But of course, unless you know of these amazing longitudinal studies in international contexts that track how children's improvements in learning factor into their earning potential that I don't know of, or none of my co-authors know of, then you're going to require these like very strong assumptions to think that what applies in the US applies in these developing country settings, which might not be something that you might buy, and that's why we have these 2 other ways of thinking about cost benefit. We use the estimates of one of our co-authors, Chris Walters, has done with Pat Klein, reviewing literature from the US, estimating the relationship between improvements in short-term improvements in test scores and improvements in earnings. We first estimate sort of the PDV of future earnings for the control group. We use information from the context of Tamil Nadu. We have some assumptions about how many days per year you work, what your annual earnings will be when in the labor force, your real wage growth. We're quite conservative in that. We have a baseline discount rate. I'll come back to that in just a second. Then we calculate that the average PDV of lifetime earnings is about 3.6 million rupees, which again, the relationship with the dollar is $1 is about 68 rupees. Then we combine this information with our treatment effects, which on the combined measure is about 0.11 standard deviations, with this sort of like estimates linking test scores to earnings, which is sort of like 13% relationship for every standard deviation improvement leads to a 13% improvement in earnings. And then we calculate our sort of the present value of the program. Then we combine these two informations to calculate this benefit cost ratio. We start with the number of children we actually observe in the centers per year. But obviously, as old kids were leaving, new kids were coming in. So we impute, we use a cohort adjustment factor to consider the fact that the benefit of the program is more than the benefit on the kids that we observe. We get a predicted benefit per center, we get the program cost per center, and we see that the benefits of the center sort of are 13 times roughly the cost of the program. Now, you might not think that those are the right parameters, which is why we do some sensitivity analysis for all the unknown parameters. We sample from either a uniform distribution or a truncated normal distribution, and we find that the ranges of the cost-benefit analysis are still quite worth looking at, right? So even if you were sampling from a uniform distribution, the 5th percentile of this range of parameters is a benefit cost ratio of 4. The 95th percentile is 39. Wherever you think you might be right, you're still in the land where it's worth paying for this program. We also sort of follow the work of Nathaniel Hendren and others to calculate the marginal value of public funds. So how do you think about the marginal benefit of the intervention compared to this marginal cost? The benefit is, we're considering the after-tax benefits to participants, and the cost is the net cost to the government, so the cost of the program minus all the money that it would recover through taxing the kids once they're in the labor market. Now, obviously, we are accounting for the expected increase in future tax revenue, but the main drawback of this approach is you're making these assumptions about what the expected tax rate should be. Now, we estimate that if kids pay once they enter the labor market a tax rate of about 8%, costs are more than paid back in present value by expected tax revenues. Now, you might think developing countries, so on and so forth, like tax collection is very leaky, sure. But if you only think about sort of the goods and services tax, which everyone needs to pay every time that they purchase a goods or service, you're in the realm of 12 to 18%. So 8% seems quite reasonable to us. And obviously, if you look at the Policy Insights website and you look at sort of the MBPF of early childhood education programs in the US, this seems to be quite in line with the fact that they also pay for more than pay for themselves. Now, you might not think either of those things are persuasive, and I'm with you. So let me give you a third alternative. The main alternative way that the government uses these funds, I'm almost done, is to think about improvements in the salary of the main worker. So that's exactly what we did. We had another experimental arm in which we increased the salary of the main worker by about 20%. So we compared how our intervention would compare with that intervention in terms of cost effectiveness. This companion paper, we evaluated this policy. And what you can do is not think about, whether to expand funding for the program, but basically how would you allocate funds within that program or sector? And those results are not super encouraging. So focus for a second in these two columns. We're comparing the effect of the ECC or the additional facilitator on the household sample and the center sample with that of the across the board pay increase, which is negative in one of the cases statistically significant. So whether you think those effects are negative or not, it doesn't really matter. Sort of even if you think that there's zero, the cost effectiveness of this alternative way of allocating the funds is obviously, in terms of comparison, much better than that of the default way in which the government allocates these funds. All right, run through and now tell you the details of the contributions, but 5 main contributions. We can improve the quality of early childhood education through a cost-effective, scalable program implemented by the government. We can promote catch-up growth beyond age 3. We can also hire a community level staff lower than the civil service salaries, because remember, Anguity workers are not civil servants, and that is a promising option for expanding state capacity. Why does that matter? If you look at developing countries, they typically have a very low public employee to citizen ratio, and that typically affects not only the quality of service delivery, but that premium that you're paid for being in the government sector is typically poorly correlated with productivity. So you could actually expand how much the government can do by this type of policy. And then finally, and I think that we were talking about this before, sorry, almost finally, is this, if you look at the early childhood education literature, there's a lot of emphasis on qualifications for trainers. I don't think that is mistaken. I think that in a setting where learning levels are so low, when you have an existing prescriptive curriculum and you can get a lot done with 6 days of training, you may be able to expand the capacity of the government to do more with less. And then, no, this is not a class size reduction intervention. However, we interpret our evidence as being consistent with potential benefit of small educator to children ratios among younger children. That's it, guys.